Welcome to another video. Today we are going to be studying biology, and in this lesson we're going to be covering what I think are essential exam style questions that begin with the command words comment, discuss, and evaluate. And especially in the recent years, these questions have become more and more common, and you're likely to see at least 2 to 3 questions beginning with these command words on paper 1 and maybe 2 questions on paper 2. So they are really important. So the aim of today's lesson is to give you my strategy, which I use to solve these questions. And we will be looking at some example past paper questions, and we will try to solve them using the strategy that I will be teaching you. So first of all, let's take a look at the command word taxonomy. And you can find this all the way at the back of the biology specification, which you can download from Pearson Edexcel website. And I've highlighted the 3 command words that we will be focusing on today: comment on, discuss, and evaluate. So for comment, the way that I like to think about comment is essentially the same as writing a comment on social media. So on social media, you can write comments on your friends' posts, you can write about what you think of them. It's kind of the same thing here, except for the fact that you are making scientific judgments. You are using biological knowledge to make professional, scientific, biological judgments and to give your educated opinion on a situation. So that's how I like to think about comment items. As for discuss, we have 3 bullet points that the exam board has provided us with. And in my opinion, I think these 3 bullet points apply to all these 3 different command words, even though they are only shown with the discuss command word. So the first one says, identify the issue, situation, problem, argument that is being assessed within the question. And I think this is a very important bullet point that Edexcel has provided us, and I think it's very useful. And that's because the questions that we will be dealing with, let's start with these command words, are going to be set in novel contexts. And when I say novel context, I mean that you are going to be facing these questions in situations that you've not seen before. So for example, you might get a question about an animal in a habitat that you've never studied before, but the physiology that you need to explain what is happening is from within the specification. So it could be any of the chapters from the animal physiology section. So that's kind of an example of what I mean by novel context. And this bullet point is important because it's telling us candidates that you will face questions in novel contexts, and it is your job to figure out what knowledge that you need to draw from within the specification to be able to explain that particular situation. So this bullet point is really important. And the second one, it says explore all aspects of an issue, problem, situation, argument. And the way I like to think about it is that Edexcel is telling us to consider situations holistically and to look at an issue from both sides of the spectrum. And I will get in detail about what I mean with this when we do some example questions later. And as for the third bullet point, the key thing here is reasoning. And for reasoning, just remember that you need to use your biological knowledge. So you're basically just explaining the issue or situation using your biological knowledge. And as for evaluate, well, that's a big paragraph. I'm not going to read that. But the way that I like to think about the command word evaluate is to analyze. So it's about reviewing information. It's about analyzing the information. But this is just, to give you a general idea. We will dive deep into the strategies, and like I said, these 3 bullet points are the key ones. So those are the 3 ones that you need to have in mind. But let's go into the main part of this lesson now, which is to give you my strategy for dealing with these questions. And at the heart of my strategy is determining the nature of the question. So nature in this case just means the type of question that's going to appear. And generally, there are 3 types that I've seen whilst I was practicing the past year papers. And these are apply, conclusions, and trends and changes. So let's begin with the very first type of question, which are apply questions. And apply questions are basically just explain questions. So you'll have to use your biological knowledge in novel contexts to explain the situation. So to illustrate this strategy, we need to look at an example question, and the questions that I've chosen is from 2024 June paper 1R, and it's question 9 part C. So first thing first, let's read the given information. So it says the diagram shows a sustainable glasshouse system that is used in the UK to grow tomato plants throughout the year. The glasshouse has artificial lighting and heating powered by electricity from a wood-burning power station. CO2 is pumped from the power station into the glasshouse, and we have a diagram showing how this entire system works. Then we proceed to the actual question, which tells us to discuss the advantages of growing tomato plants in this glasshouse system. In your answer, include benefits for both the farmers and also for the environment. So the first tip that I would give for any kind of comment, discuss, evaluate question is to study the given information very, very closely, and you have to interpret where your biological knowledge can be applied in whatever situation they've put you into. And in a second, I will show you how I will be trying to interpret this using my biological knowledge. And the second tip that I want to give is to plan your responses very quickly, very briefly before writing the actual answer. When I say plan, it's not necessarily a full out plan like a bullet point list. All I mean when I say plan is to think about what you're going to say and what the best, most concise and most organized way to say is. So you're just going to be doing this in your head. You can jot on a few notes if you want to, but the key is to just organize your thoughts together and to present it in a logical, organized manner. Now for this particular question, these are the things that I would highlight. So as for benefits for farmers, I will highlight them in red, and as for the environment, I will highlight them in green. And now that's where I am going to be applying my biological knowledge. So when I see artificial lighting, heating, and carbon dioxide, I'm thinking about one thing, and that thing is photosynthesis. Well, high light intensity, warm temperature, high CO2 concentration, they are all increasing the rate of photosynthesis. Now, if we have a faster rate of photosynthesis, the plants can produce more glucose, and therefore they grow more, and therefore the yield of the crops will increase. Hence, the benefit for the farmer is that he can sell more crops. So that explains the part which is the advantage for the farmer. And as for the environment, well, CO2 being pumped into the glasshouse rather than into the atmosphere, that reduces CO2 emissions, so there are fewer greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, so there's less greenhouse effect. And because we use wood, well, wood is a renewable energy, and because we use wood instead of like gasoline or diesel, we have a less dependence on fossil fuels. So we would talk about the benefits for the farmers first, and then we'll talk about the benefits for the environment. And that's how I'm roughly and organizing my thoughts and ideas together. Now, if you don't plan like that, and if you just get straight into writing, what could happen is you should talk about artificial lighting improving photosynthesis, heating improving photosynthesis, carbon dioxide improving photosynthesis. So you're basically repeating the same thing 3 times, so you're wasting your time just writing, even though you're basically getting 1 mark for saying the same thing 3 times. So yeah, I do strongly encourage planning and to do it briefly and quickly, because it will save you a lot of time writing unnecessary stuff. And here is my model answer. This is the part for the farmer's advantages, and this is the part for the environment's advantages. And if we look at the mark scheme, I am going to be getting 4 plus 3, which is 7 marks. And that's already an overkill because we only need 5. But I still like to write logical, well thought of responses, because it still makes sense, but try to limit what you're going to write if you think that you are losing time by writing these extra points. And time management is very important, and because you're going to be planning, your writing needs to be fast as well to be able to catch up with the time limit of the exam. Next up, the second type of question are conclusion questions. Now, conclusion questions are questions where you have to assess the correctness of conclusions, for the lack of a better word. And the way we do this is by following this 1, 2, 3 approach. And this is the way that I did it during my exams that I gave just a couple of weeks ago. And we will also be considering both for and against. So we're going to be arguing both for the fact that the conclusion is indeed correct, but also for the fact that the conclusion is not really that good, you know? And this is a technique that I learned from Science with Hazel. Her YouTube channel is absolutely awesome. You should check it out. And if you're an iGCSE student, you should probably know her. If you don't, you're probably living under a rock. But this is a very OP technique that we're going to use for discuss, comment, evaluate questions. And this is the 1, 2, 3 step that I used in solving these conclusion questions. So let's jump straight ahead into an example question from 2020, paper 2BR, and question 4, part B. And right away, we're going to study the information given very closely. So it's a pedometer question. He's using it to investigate wind on transpiration. He's going to measure the water uptake for 30 minutes without a fan and then with the fan, and he's going to, you know, divide the water uptake by the total surface area of the leaves, and here's given data. Now we commence to the question. It says, the student concludes that plants will grow better in windy conditions. Evaluate this conclusion. So the words in the stem of the question signal to us that this is a conclusion question. And therefore, we're going to use that 1, 2, 3 strategy whilst arguing for the conclusion as well as against the conclusion. So here's how I would split my response. Obviously, in exam conditions, we're not doing this. This is just for the purpose of illustrating it. In exam conditions, I would write the for part and then I would follow it up with the against part at the bottom. Okay, so step 1 is to analyze the data. So here's what I would do with step 1. Looking at the data, it says that more water was lost when we were in windy conditions, and that's true because we have 12.5 here. So that's what the data is saying to us. It's saying to us that with a fan, the water is greater, and therefore there was greater water loss when we were put in windy conditions. So that's the very first step, which is to analyze the data. Now let's look at step 2. Step 2, we are going to be using our biological knowledge. And we are going to be using our biological knowledge to explain the fact that plants will grow better in windy conditions. Okay, so how do we know that plants will grow better when the water uptake is greater? Well, we know that, you know, the transpiration stream is going to be faster. We're going to have more mineral ions, and we're going to also have more cooling, which will prevent the overheating of the plant. So that is how we're going to be using step 2, the application of biological knowledge, to support the conclusion. Okay, but what about against the conclusion? Can we go against the conclusion and use our biological knowledge to explain it? And the answer is yes. Because if we have too fast of a transpiration rate, well, the plant is gonna wilt because you have too much water loss. And water loss also means that the guard cells will become flaccid and that will close the stomata, so less CO2 is absorbed. That will decrease the photosynthesis rate, and that will in fact reduce the growth. So the conclusion is kind of wrong. All right, and that's step 1 and step 2 ticked off. But what about step 3? Let's assess the experimental method. Is the experiment good? And when we assess the experimental method, the thing that I like to look at most often is reliability and validity. As for accuracy, it rarely comes up in biology, so I tend to ignore it. Now, reliability is about reproducibility, and it's about how similar your results are. The way to improve reliability is to take repeats to calculate the mean, and the reason we take repeats is so that we can compare our results and look for anomalous results. So anomalous results basically means outlier values. And if they are outlier values, we take them out and we calculate the mean with the numbers that are similar to each other. And validity is about fairness, and it depends on the variables that are controlled. So both abiotic and biotic variables should be controlled, and that ensures that only the independent variable has an effect on the dependent variable. So going back to our question, looking at reliability, it's pretty bad because we only have one set of data for each condition, so it's not reliable. And it means that either of the results could be the anomalous result, but we don't know because we don't have other results to compare with. So the reliability is just very bad. What about validity? Well, it's bad as well because we have no idea of the biotic and abiotic variables that are being controlled. And the most important ones are temperature and humidity, because if you don't control the temperature and humidity, they could directly be impacting the water uptake, which could interfere with the results, because we don't exactly know how the windy conditions are going to be affecting the water loss. And that right there is the complete response. And if we break it down into the 3 steps, the first step would be data analysis, second step would be applying the knowledge, and the third step would be assessing the experimental method. And that's how the response breaks down into those 3 steps. And if you look at the mark scheme also breaks down into those 3 steps: data analysis, applying your knowledge, and assessing the experimental method, which is why I think these 3 steps are really, really, really good at cracking these questions. However, step 2 is sometimes skipped. And the reason we skip step 2 sometimes is because in some questions, we can't apply our biological knowledge because we don't have that biological knowledge within the specification. And that's the kind of question that scares most students, because they don't know how to explain these questions. And the answer to that is you don't explain those questions. You just analyze the data and you assess the experimental method. So you go straight from 1 to 3. And this question is exactly that kind of question. So this question is from 2021 November, and it's from paper 1, and it's a question about statins. Now, if you do 4HB1, you do know what statins are. But if you do only 4BI1 biology, you do not know what statins are. So this is going to be a very, very, very novel context question. Reading the question, it says this is about an investigation where they investigate one type of statin on the risk of having a heart attack. They use two group of people. They have one taking a control, one taking the statin, and they calculate the percentage of people that get a heart attack for 4 years. And here is the question. It says a conclusion from the data is that statins reduce the risk of heart attacks, and they want you to discuss this conclusion. So because we can't use our biological knowledge, we are going to analyze the data, but we are not going to be applying our biological knowledge, because using 4BI1 knowledge, there's just nothing that we can do to explain the scenario. And so we're going to skip straight to step 3, which is to scrutinize and assess the experimental method. But we are still going to be splitting our response into for and against. So to support the conclusion, we have the data. Because with statins, the percentage of having a heart attack is lower. So analyzing the data, that's what we get. And that supports the conclusion. But what else do we have? Nothing. So we go straight to step 3, which is to assess the experimental method. And the experimental method, when we assess it, it's probably going to be going against the statement. And that's because the data here is not reliable. And the reason we say that is because we have no idea how many people were involved. We have no idea what the group size is, so we can't be sure if the data is reliable or not. And as for validity, we don't really have the controls like diet or sex and age, which are biotic variables, and diet, which is an abiotic variable. And these could be affecting the results, but we don't have any idea if they did keep them the same or not. And in this particular question, you will also have to do some critical thinking. And the critical thinking that we have to do is to critically assess the experiment. Okay, so we have to develop the mindset of someone who is trying to be a hater of the scientists who did this experiment. And if we develop the mindset, we will see that they only tested one type of statin, but they are making the conclusion that statins reduce the risk of heart attacks. So basically it's an inflated conclusion because they test only one type, but they are saying that generally statins reduce the risk of heart attacks, which is not correct, because if we change the experiment and do it with another type of statin, the results might not be the same. We just don't have the data to make a conclusion for other type of statins. So the conclusion isn't really representative because they do it only on a single type of statin. Also, the experiment was done only for 4 years. And if they did it for a longer period of time, the results could be different. We don't know. And because it's a heart attack question, which is like a long-term problem, 4 years is not really a sufficient duration. So we would also comment on that. We will also raise criticism for the experiment that is being set up. And so that's the part that I would write for the experiment. experimental method assessment. And looking at the mark scheme, as you can see, we have 1 mark for data analysis, and the rest are they are just criticizing the experiment. They are just scrutinizing the experiment, saying that this is not good, this is not good, and therefore the conclusion you've made here isn't really that trustable, it's not really that correct, for the lack of a better word. Alright, final type of question. And this kind of question are trends, changes, patterns. This is the data question. And the way that I like to think about these questions is they are describe questions, but with more marks, and therefore they require more effort on the part of the candidate to be able to gain 4 marks on these questions. So the tip that I would give, the advice that I would give for this kind of questions is to study the data very, very closely and to find out the patterns that might be worth noting. And in my experience, comparisons are quite very useful and they are very common mark points. So try to write comparatively when you are describing in these questions. And if you want to support your points, don't just quote data, manipulate it. So what I mean is, if you were to say this number is 12 and this number is 8 and therefore this is greater, instead of saying that, how about you calculate a percentage change and say this result is blah 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 percentage more than this result. So data manipulation is better than quoting the data. So if you're going to be supporting your points, do manipulate the data instead of just plain quotation. And let's take a look at a sample question from 2023 November paper 2. And this is an investigation on spontaneous mutations in yeast during mitosis and meiosis. And here we have tested the mutation rates for 3 different strains, and they are repeated twice per strain per type of cell division. And here's the question. It says comment on the differences in the rates of mutations for mitosis and meiosis in the different yeast strains. And clearly, it's not a biological knowledge, it's not an applied question, because I know absolutely nothing about mutation rates in mitosis and meiosis in these yeast strains. So that cancels out. And is it a conclusion question? And the answer is no, because scientists have made no conclusions. They've made no claims on what the results of the investigation might be. So this cancels out as well. And so it leaves us with only our third option, which is to look at the trends and the patterns in the data. And for these kind of questions, I would always begin with the most obvious ones. So the most obvious thing to do here is to compare the different yeast strains and to compare the different type of cell divisions. So comparing the different type of cell divisions, to begin with comparing the different types of strain, well, we can see that for mitosis, strain 5160 has the greatest mean mutation rate. We do the same for meiosis, and we find that strain 5207 has the greatest mean mutation rate. And the mean mutation rate, if we compare mitosis and meiosis across all strains, we see that the mutation rate is higher for meiosis than it is for mitosis. And this is going to be the most important patterns in data that I see that I'm going to write about first. And then from this, I see that I've written 3 separate arguments, and so I might get 3 marks. So to get the final mark for a full marker, what I would go and look at is I would look at something that's more noticeable, something significant in the data. And the thing that I see here is that there is a giant difference between the mitosis mutation rate and the meiosis mutation rate for strain 5207. In fact, this is the biggest difference that we see in all strains. Here the differences are quite small, but here the difference is very large, and therefore that's the thing that I would write. It's a very significant pattern that I see in the data. And that would give me 4 marks. And as you can see, all the mark points are for describing the patterns in data that are quite significant. But to be able to see them, you must, of course, practice your past year paper questions, and you might have to, practice looking at data patterns. So that's all of the different natures that I want to cover. But generally, here are the reminders, here are the notes that I want you to take. And the first one is that these questions give you the freedom to explore. Which is why, even though they are kind of the same as describe and explain questions, the command words are different. They aren't describe, they aren't explain. The command words are comment on, discuss, evaluate. And that is signaling you to the candidate that you have the freedom to explore. And of course, you have to explore scientifically. So don't limit yourself to only the things that you know. Use all the information in the question and use all of your knowledge to try to make connections, to try to make logical arguments scientifically. And this is a reminder from 2022 June paper 1B principal examiner feedback, i.e. the examiner report. So the examiners of Edexcel are telling you to consider the issues holistically and to use all the information given, to use all your own knowledge and to explore scientifically. And they also said that you need to include as many points as possible, and they are telling you to go as far as you can go in these kind of questions. And another common reminder that I see in examiner reports is that you should always comment on the experimental design, and it is also why it is an essential step in my strategy for dealing with these questions. It is step 3. And as for the data questions, trends, changes, patterns, always look for details, always look for significant points, and with practice over time, you will get better. And here is a little bonus section. This is Bloom's taxonomy. For those who might not know, Bloom's taxonomy is basically a way of classifying different levels of mastery of knowledge. And these comment on, discuss, evaluating questions, in my opinion, are assessing the top levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So that means that they are demanding the greatest level of mastery from the candidates on the topics that they are assessing, especially for those applied questions where you have to use your biological knowledge. So what this means is if you do well, if you get near full mark, or if you get full marks in these kind of questions, it means that you have achieved a great level of mastery for these kind of topics. However, if you are struggling with these topics, that means that you are only understanding them, or you're only remembering them, you're only memorizing these topics. You don't really know how to unlock these higher levels of learning. So you should revisit your study systems, and you should revisit the topics that you are struggling with for these kind of questions, and you should level up your learning so that you can achieve these top levels of knowledge mastery. All right, so that's pretty much everything that we have for today's lesson. Thank you guys for watching until the end. Good luck with all of your examinations. We'll have more videos coming up soon, so stay subscribed to the channel if you're interested. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.